Good afternoon. Thank you for joining our webinar today. I'm Emma Waldron, WCVA's Risk Procurement and Governance Manager, and I'm also WCVA's Data Protection Officer. This will be our 10th webinar of the Desktop Data series, and with GDPR fast approaching, we need to be confident that we are well prepared ahead of the new regulations being implemented in May. Our speaker is Bethan Bonsall from the ICO. Welcome, Bethan.
Hello.
Bethan is the ICO's lead policy officer, and she's here today to discuss CCTV. So we anticipate today's session will take approximately 30 minutes, and there'll be an opportunity to ask questions afterwards. But also, please feel free to add any questions to the chat pane as we're going through the session, and we'll aim to answer them at the end of the presentation. There will also be an opportunity to share your comments by completing a short survey, which we will share the details of on the final slide. Okay, over to you, Bethan.
Thanks, Emma, and good afternoon to all of you dialing in today and those listening at a later date. I'm Bethan, and as Emma said, I'm the lead policy officer for the ICO's office in Wales. As many of you may know, the ICO is the UK regulator for the Data Protection Act, the Privacy and Electronic Communication Regulations, which govern direct marketing or electronic direct marketing, and other associated information rights legislation. During this webinar under the Desktop Data series, we'll be looking at the topic of CCTV. Regardless of whether your charity operates CCTV or not, the advice contained within this webinar will hopefully be useful to many of you ahead of May 25th this year, when the Data Protection Act as we know it is being replaced with the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR for short. So, the advice contained within today's webinar can all be found in the ICO's Code of Practice for Surveillance Cameras. Now, that Code of Practice was formerly called the CCTV Code of Practice, but the reason for the name change will become apparent hopefully in the next few moments. I think when we think of typical CCTV, gone are the days when we're referring to just a camera on top of a pole, for example, overlooking a car park or a busy street. Surveillance cameras are no longer a passive technology that only record and retain images and then become deleted. Rather, surveillance cameras are now often used as a proactive technology that can identify people of interest and keep detailed records of people's information. So let's have a bit of interaction before we go any further. Given the change of name from CCTV Code of Practice to the wider Surveillance Camera Code of Practice, what type of surveillance methods can you think of that we're used to seeing these days that go beyond what we were used to formerly as just normal CCTV cameras? So if you're able to type any examples that you can think of, there's no right or wrong answers. It's just so we can get a feel for the reason as to why the Code of Practice has expanded just from CCTV to more widely used surveillance methods. So if you're happy to just talk.
Okay, so some of the responses we've got coming in are in-car cameras, dash cams, webcams.
Brilliant. They're really useful examples, and again, particularly with things like dash cams, it's not just a static camera that's only capturing people that are walking perhaps past a building, but it's stuff that a dash cam can potentially capture thousands of bits of information every day if it's in a busy traffic route. The example of CCTV on buses and coaches, that's a good example as well. So yeah, brilliant. There's those examples, so thanks for your contributions. There's also another couple of areas where we've seen the change in surveillance type methods. So for example, you've got body-worn video, so typically used by police, automatic number plate recognition, so a vehicle would pass an ANPR camera, perhaps at the start of a car park, its registration number is read and instantly checked against database records of vehicles that might perhaps be of interest to those operating the CCTV. So maybe someone's been parking in a car park for longer than the normal amount of time or the relevant amount of time, and that ANPR camera will be able to use that data rather than just look at it, process it, and then delete it at a later date. You've also got things such as drones, so unmanned aerial systems that again are potentially capable of capturing quite a lot of personal data. So it's really useful just to see how far we've come in terms of technology and the types of surveillance that organisations are capable of doing these days compared to when we were just used to normal CCTV cameras. Now, having said that, the focus of today's webinars will be on traditional CCTV cameras that you've either got within your charity's building or perhaps outside. But certainly, it is important to be aware that the wider types do exist. So Regardless of the type of surveillance camera you're using, if there is personal data that's being processed, whether it's from a dash cam, a CCTV camera, body-worn video, the provisions of the current Data Protection Act will apply, and as of May 25th this year, the provisions of the GDPR, so the General Data Protection Regulation, will also apply. So let's have a little look at what we'll cover as part of today's webinar. First of all, we'll be looking at when to decide whether to use CCTV in the first instance. So obviously it's an organisational decision whether to go on and install CCTV cameras. So we'll be looking at what you need to do in terms of when deciding to use CCTV. We'll also look at the importance of adopting a privacy by design approach when using CCTV. We'll explore some of the factors you need to consider when deciding where in fact to locate the cameras to get the most effective use out of them. We'll be highlighting the importance of the need to have good governance in place to oversee the CCTV. We'll have a quick look and explore some of the rights that individuals have in relation to their information when it's captured by CCTV. And finally, we'll look at the requirement and the importance of the requirement to be transparent when your charity is using CCTV, which links very strongly to the new right under GDPR called the right to be informed. So one of the questions that we do often get asked in the ICO, it might be a small charity, a small organisation, even a bigger organisation. We might have a phone call to the office to say, look, I'm a small charity in Wales, I want to install CCTV, what do I need to do? So when we are asked that question, we would really advise that the organisation takes a step back and ask themselves whether it is actually the most appropriate solution to address the problem that you as a charity are trying to overcome. Using surveillance systems can be privacy intrusive because they're capable of placing large numbers of law-abiding people under surveillance and recording them going about their day-to-day activities. So as a charity, you should therefore really think about what your aim is when you're considering using CCTV and explore other options that might help you achieve those aims in a less privacy intrusive manner. So an example would be if the car park outside of your charity's offices has a high rate of cars broken into, then rather than going straight towards installing CCTV, consider whether something such as improving the lighting might in fact reduce the problem more effective than those CCTV cameras would. Adopting a privacy by design approach will really help you determine whether CCTV is the most proportionate and suitable option, and if so, it will help you mitigate the risks that the CCTV might bring about. Those of you who've had the chance to listen to the webinar we ran in December, called Privacy by Design, will know that Privacy by Design is an approach that the ICO has championed over the years. And it's basically an approach to projects and new initiatives, for example, that promotes privacy and data protection compliance from the start, rather than ignoring those issues and then having to bolt on data protection afterthought at the end of a project. Once you've kind of invested time and money into something and you haven't thought about data protection up front, Privacy by Design is a really key way of addressing those issues up front. So whilst Privacy by Design isn't a legal requirement under the current Data Protection Act, under the GDPR, you as charities will have a general obligation to implement technical and organisational measures to show that you've considered and integrated data protection into your activities when processing personal data. And Privacy by Design is a key mechanism to demonstrate that your charity is doing this. A key way of integrating data protection into your activities is by carrying out what we call a privacy impact assessment, as they're known under the current Data Protection Act, or under GDPR they're known as Data Protection Impact Assessment. So we use the terms PIA, DPIA interchangeably as they both essentially mean the same thing. We've got a really useful code of practice on privacy impact assessments, which set out the key stages of an impact assessment and what they would include. And as I've already mentioned, the previous webinar we ran in December called Privacy by Design is also a really useful reference for your charity if you're hoping to learn more about what you need to do when conducting PIAs. Now, carrying out an impact assessment isn't mandatory under the current law, but it's certainly encouraged, particularly when your charity is embarking on either a new project or initiative, where that project or initiative involves the collection and use of personal data. GDPR, however, sets out specific circumstances whereby a DPIA must be carried out, one of which is if your charity is using new technologies. So deciding whether or not to install CCTV would therefore be a perfect example of when GDPR would require you to conduct a DPIA. One of the key things that a DPIA allows you to do is to make an assessment of the necessity and the proportionality of the processing in relation to what you're hoping to achieve, so your purpose. This links back to the example a few moments ago. So if your purpose is to reduce crime in a car park, and that purpose could be achieved by a less privacy intrusive mechanism, such as improved lighting, then the DPIA has already allowed you to reduce the impact on privacy of individuals. So they've got a lot of benefits. Now, if you've conducted a privacy impact assessment and you've explored other options and you're satisfied that installing CCTV is the most appropriate way to achieve your aims, then what else do you need to consider? Choosing where to site your cameras is important and is also an area that you're likely to have addressed as part of your impact assessment. Cameras should be sited to ensure that they don't view areas that aren't of interest to you and areas that aren't intended to be part of your surveillance. You'll have to consider things such as the season you're installing the camera. So if you're installing a camera in winter, make sure that the same camera won't be obscured by the growth of plants and trees in the summer. So it's actually quite interesting how nature can in fact interact with data protection. It's something that I wouldn't have ever imagined before, but it certainly can, because there's no point in installing a camera in winter where, come the summer, your purpose isn't achieved because you've got a massive, plant that's grown in front of that camera. Be very careful about installing cameras within a building, so particularly in areas that have heightened expectations of privacy. Organisations that opt to use cameras in areas where people really do have that high privacy expectation should only be using CCTV to deal with the most exceptional of concerns. A similar point relates to the audio recording of staff using CCTV. So again, audio recording is so privacy intrusive that it should only be carried out in the most exceptional of circumstances, and would also need to be addressed by a privacy impact assessment to consider whether that purpose that you're hoping to achieve could be achieved by something different other than audio recording. So once you've looked at the location and you've chosen an appropriate area to install your CCTV camera or multiple cameras, your responsibilities certainly don't stop there. Ensuring effective administration is key, so think about whether you've got policies and procedures that inform staff about what their responsibilities are in relation to the CCTV. These could include policies on, for example, how to deal with third-party requests for CCTV. So if the police request footage from an incident outside of your building, there should be policies in place that a member of staff receiving such a request from a third party would know at least, who to refer that request to. And make sure that if you have got policies in place, that they've been communicated to the appropriate members of staff, because it's all good and well having a policy, but if you've not communicated that to staff that need to be aware of it, then you're not trying to help them achieve their data protection obligations. Another key point in terms of governance is to look at whether you've updated your registration with the ICO. So if you're required to register with us as a data controller, or you're not required, then having CCTV would change that, and you would need to let us know that you are processing data for the purposes of, having CCTV in place. So check that you've updated your registration. And also retention's important, so setting out appropriate retention periods is a really key way of ensuring effective governance. As many of you may know, the Data Protection Act nor the GDPR sets out any specific minimum or maximum retention periods which apply to information captured by CCTV. So the retention period should really reflect your own charity's purpose for recording the information in the first place. So it should therefore only be kept for the shortest period necessary to serve that purpose. And the retention shouldn't just be determined by the storage capacity of your system. So if a system can store footage for 5 weeks before being overwritten, then that doesn't mean that you should automatically go for a retention period of 5 weeks. You should really be opting for a shorter retention period if it's more in line with your purpose. So consider retention, and again, that would be backed up by a retention policy. As we mentioned earlier on in the webinar, and indeed it's been a theme across other desktop data webinars, individuals have very strong rights in relation to their information when that's being handled by an organisation. So one of the most commonly exercised rights is the right of subject access, which allows individuals to request personal data from any charity or any organisation that's holding it. Now, sometimes it's easy for members of the public to realise or to oversee that the fact that this does include information that's captured by CCTV cameras. Ultimately, if I'm walking past a CCTV camera and I'm identifiable from that footage, then that is, just as much my personal data as perhaps an email with my name in would be. So at the moment, if you do receive a subject access request, so someone requesting their data, you've got 40 calendar days to deal with a request. But under the GDPR, the timescale reduces to 1 month. So it's really important, therefore, that staff should be aware of this right. They should know how to recognise a valid request, and they should also know and be confident in terms of who to pass that request on to within your charity. And again, that's backed up by having good policies and procedures and making sure that anyone that could potentially receive a request would have a good policy in place to kind of advise them in terms of how to deal with that. We do recognise that requests for CCTV can sometimes be difficult to handle, particularly where there's third-party data concerned. So I would strongly suggest that if you've had a request for CCTV and you're not exactly sure how to proceed, then certainly have a look at our Subject Access Code of Practice and also our previous desktop data webinar that my colleague Helen ran in, I think it was in October, because that covers more about the right of subject access and how to handle those, kind of trickier requests that do involve third-party data. Another right that individuals have is a right to know that the CCTV is in fact in operation. So this doesn't just apply to members of the public, but also, staff have a right to know. Anyone that's being captured by CCTV has a right to know that that is in operation. Under the current DPA, so the current Data Protection Act, you've got an obligation to ensure that the processing you're carrying out is fair and lawful. So that's part of Principle 1 of the current law. And part of being fair requires you to tell individuals what's happening to their information and what rights they have in relation to it. The most effective way of doing this is by using prominently placed signs at the entrance to a building, for example, and reinforcing this with further signs as necessary inside the building or inside the area where CCTV is in use. Clear and prominent signs are particularly important where the surveillance systems are very discreet or in locations where individuals wouldn't expect to be under surveillance, so those areas where people have quite a heightened expectation of privacy. So, as a general rule, signs should be clearly visible and readable, because if they're not visible or not readable, then it makes them pretty redundant. They should contain details of the organisation operating the system, if this isn't already clear. They should state the purpose for the CCTV being in operation, so in most cases it's likely to be something along the lines of crime prevention. And they should contain basic contact details such as an email address, website address or telephone number, for example, so that the individual is able to contact your organisation or your charity if they want to know more about the processing or if they want to exercise any of their rights, so for example, the right of subject access. Now, we've only had a quick whistle-stop tour of the considerations that you as charities need to make when you're using CCTV. So before we finish and take any questions that you may have, I'd just like to draw your attention to some of the resources that the ICO's got available to help you comply with data protection laws. So the yellow code that you can see on the left is the guidance where the content of today's webinar has mostly been lifted from. So please do have a look at our code of practice for surveillance cameras if you do need more information. And just to emphasise that earlier point that it used to be called our CCTV code of practice, but obviously given the nature of technology, the expansion of the way that surveillance cameras and surveillance methods have kind of taken along the last few years, it's now a code of practice for wider surveillance, but it's certainly particularly useful and it does include the use of CCTV. And we've obviously mentioned GDPR a lot throughout this webinar and throughout the rest of the desktop data series. So I'd encourage you to familiarise yourselves with the guide to GDPR, which is on the right-hand side. So the guide includes information on the concept of privacy by design that we've mentioned about, and many other key areas where the law will be changing in just under 4 months' time. So certainly have a look at that, download it, print it out if you wish, for more detailed information about your requirements under the GDPR. We've also got a really good series of self-assessment toolkits on our website. So there's one in particular, there's different modules available. There's one on CCTV in particular. So if you are considering installing CCTV or you want to make sure that if you're operating CCTV already, you're doing so in a way that's compliant with the current law and then you're future-proofing that with GDPR. There's, the CCTV model in particular. As you can see, one of the examples on the first page, I think that's the first question that you get in that. It's all about the privacy impact assessment and having that privacy by design approach to actually ask yourself, well, we're thinking of CCTV. Is this going to be the most appropriate option? Or is there something else that we can achieve in a less privacy intrusive manner that would also help us to achieve our aims as a charity? So certainly have a look at that and the other modules, and you can assess your current level of compliance in terms of the current Data Protection Act and ahead of GDPR. And finally, I certainly hope this webinar has been useful for you listening today and those that are dialing in at a later date. And I'll now hand back to Emma to see if there are any questions from me after that whistle-stop tour.
Thank you very much for that, Bethan. Much appreciated. So now that we have the a representative from the Information Commissioner's Office here, it would be a good opportunity for you to ask questions. And looking at the chat pane, obviously type your questions into the chat pane. We do have a question already from Emma. So we are developing a lift share project for rural Pembrokeshire. If some of the drivers have dash cams fitted to their cars, should we insist they inform passengers we match them with, or is this up to them?
So that's a good question, and it ultimately depends on who the data controller for those dash cams would be. Regardless of whether it's yourselves and your organisation that's installing those cameras, or whether they're cameras that happen to be fitted to the vehicles, passengers will still have a right to know that that CCTV is in operation. So regardless of how you arrive at that decision, ultimately people will need to be informed that dash cams are in operation.
Okay, thank you, Bethan. Hope that helped you, Emma. So if anybody else has any questions, please type in. And I just wanted to refer to a comment that you made earlier on, Bethan, or a key point rather. So does having CCTV mean that a charity has to formally register with the ICO?
Okay, so the requirement to register with the ICO is a legal requirement, but there are a number of exemptions from that requirement under the current Data Protection Act. So one would be certain not-for-profit organisations, for example, aren't necessarily required to register. However, CCTV is one of those types of processing that, regardless of whether an exemption does apply, as soon as you've got CCTV, that changes the scenario and you would be taken outside of that exemption and you would be legally required to register with us. So that's certainly a really good question. So yes, the key is if you've got CCTV, then you 100% would need to be registered with the ICO, and you can do that easily by either phoning our helpline on our website, or you can start the process off online on ico.org.uk.
Thank you very much, that's very clear. Okay, so what if a charity or an organisation is a tenant in a building that has CCTV? So the CCTV isn't operated by them, but they're a tenant in that building.
So again, it's ultimately the data controller that would have to make sure that they're, ultimately complying with the GDPR or the current Data Protection Act. But various tenants should really be able to advise individuals that are captured by the cameras. So if your charity's got a small office in a very busy building, and a visitor to your office, whether it's a service user, someone that's going for an interview, if they've got any questions about that CCTV, then although you wouldn't necessarily handle that request, you would need to know who to escalate that request to. So again, it's back to the importance of that signage and knowing who in fact is operating that CCTV system.
Lovely, thank you. Okay, I can see that Tina is typing a question. So while she's typing the question, just one from me. So are there any rules about where an organisation will place the live screen that displays the CCTV?
That's a really good question, because it's back to the kind of necessity and proportionality. And if you're placing screens in an area where, Joe Blogs, Joe Public can see, then, that wouldn't be necessary. It should only be seen, so that the CCTV screen should only be monitored by those that have a genuine need to look at the CCTV. So if you've got a reception desk and someone comes in, a visitor that's there for a meeting signs in, they shouldn't be able to see the cameras. Those cameras should be obscured from their view, and they should only be seen by people that actually have the genuine requirement and the genuine need to see those screens. So that's a good question.
Great, thank you. And question from Tina, are there any standard notices available from ICO?
No, because the processing of different organisations differs quite significantly from one charity to another, or one organisation to another. We have got really good guidance in terms of notices by way of our privacy notices, transparency and control document. It's a long word, sorry, but it's a really good bit of guidance. I think we did a webinar in September, I believe. If you look on the previous desktop data webinars, there is one about privacy notices, and it breaks down that code into really nice, easy to grasp areas in terms of how you should be telling individuals what's happening to their data. So it's privacy notices, transparency and control is the name of the document.
Brilliant, thanks Bethan. I hope that helped, Tina. So there are no more questions, so we will conclude today's session. We hope that you found this session useful. To help us to improve our future webinars, please can you complete a short survey for us using the link provided on the current slide there in front of you. The link will also be circulated to you following this session. So our next session will cover contracts, liabilities and GDPR, and will be held at 2 p.m. on Monday the 19th of March. So we look forward to seeing you then again. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye everyone.